how EQs operate is like your noise canceling headphones operate, right? Because keep in mind, there were EQs far before there were computers, right? People designed electrical circuits that could perform an EQ function before we had computers, before we had VSTs, before we had anything like that. We had hardware analog EQs. And what that circuit did was it would add in the inverted phase of the signal so that it would cancel the signal out, right? Because if I take a sine wave, like here, let's go get an operator here. And I'm going to take one operator, I'm going to make a sine wave. And then I'm going to group this operator and I'm going to duplicate it so we have two chains. When we have two chains that are exactly the same, you should get a doubling of the amplitude, so because they're perfectly in phase. So when I play this, it's a sine wave. When I unmute this second one, it's the exact same wave but twice as loud, right? But if I were to take the utility plugin and invert the phase of the left side and then invert the phase of the right side, I've now inverted the phase of both of these signals. So what happens when I play operator 1 with a sine wave and operator 2 with the same sine wave out of phase? What do they sum to? Nothing. Look at that. You can see there's amplitude on each of these chains, but together they cancel each other out. So watch this. When I turn on and off operator number 2, it's going to mute operator number 1. Because those inverted sine waves are, the inverted sine wave is canceling out the normal sine wave, right? So that's how an EQ is working. It's like noise canceling headphones. So what it's doing is it's saying, hey, I want to add a signal to my signal that is the exact opposite waveform, but only in these certain frequencies, right? So that's how an EQ is removing sound, right? So this, or here, let's go back to our saw wave so we can see a little bit better. So that's why that spike, that transient that you're seeing at the beginning of the waveform, that vertical spike, is being shifted over. It's because this low out of phase wave is being added to the signal, and thus the portions of this waveform are no longer perfectly in phase with each other. So like I said before, there's an exception to when this happens, and that is when you use a linear phase EQ. So FabFilter here, they're fantastic EQ. The default is 0 latency mode, and it actually uses less processor than the Ableton EQ. It has a really fancy GUI, graphical user interface. But don't let that fool you. It's an extremely efficient EQ when it's on 0 latency mode. And when I go and select the title bar of this FabFilter, I can see in the bottom left of my screen, it says latency : 0 samples. When I select the Ableton one, it says latency 16 samples. That's because I have it on oversampling. When I have the oversampling off, that's like kind of like the high quality mode of the EQ. It gives you slightly cleaner highs to do that. You can see that the latency is at 0 samples. When I put it on oversampling mode, the latency goes up, right? So Ableton's high quality mode is one thing, but FabFilter's Pro Q3 or Pro Q2, a lot of them, they have some really fancy high quality modes. So when you go to natural phase mode, look at this. You can see it's a little better. So here's 0 latency. Actually, it's not really a little better on the thing. So whatever. But yeah, where it becomes important is the linear phase mode. When you put linear phase mode, look, the wave is pretty much the same because this is all happening below the fundamental. Look at that. I can get rid of all that low end activity without actually compromising the phase relationships of the EQ, right? It only starts to look weird when I cross the fundamental and start taking out frequencies that are present at a higher volume in the sound. And you can actually, if you look at the oscilloscope, you can actually see the harmonics, the out of phase harmonics being added to the sound. If you look closely, you'll see a slow out of phase sine wave being added, and then another sine wave being added that is twice the frequency, etc. So it's doing the opposite of what operator is doing to cancel it out. Check it out. So that's added one sine wave. It's added two. Until you're just left with this little tiny little sizzle. So why wouldn't people use linear phase EQs all the time? Well, look what happens when I select the title bar. That linear phase EQ, even on the medium quality mode, is adding 5,120 samples, which gives us 116 milliseconds of latency. That's a lot of latency. If I'm finger drumming and there's 116 milliseconds of latency, it becomes very hard for me to play. And if I were to try and even just trying to play this sound is really, really hard. So you can go to the linear phase low mode, and that only gives you 67 milliseconds of latency, or 69. But that's still one EQ is a deal breaker. And if you go on the high quality mode on maximum, it's a second and a half of latency, 66,560 samples. To have one EQ that takes out the bass. And look at this latency. I'll try and do this hard so that you can hear the sound of it smacking. It's a brutal amount of latency. It's pretty much going to render your track impossible to work on to have that amount of latency. So what a lot of people will do is they will do their mixing on zero latency mode, and then when it comes time to render their final product, they'll go through and they'll switch every single EQ in the track to linear phase mode. I do that sometimes, especially if it's like the final stages of stem mixing and I really want a high fidelity result. I'll do that, but it's a bit of a pain in the ass. One thing that you can do if you want to do this is make a save right before you do this and call it final before HQ, and then save another one and call it like HQ or linear phase or whatever, and then you go set them all to zero latency and then render. Because if you render your final product and then you want to go back and change something, you'll want a save point that's before you ruined your project with tons of latency to make it unworkable, so that you can go back and work on it. So then I'll go back to the save, the last one before HQ, make my adjustments, save it, and then do a save as again, save over the new one, turn everything to high quality mode, and then render. It's a bit of a pain in the ass. There are some other plugins that make this less of a pain in the ass, but that's a thing. So be aware of that. Your EQs are knocking your signal out of phase all the time. Every EQ, every filter you use comes at a cost.